The first thing that hit me was not the silence. It was the precision. You have to understand that my daughter, Elizabeth, is a whirlwind of chaos. Her room is usually a battlefield of discarded denim, half-finished sketches, and open candy wrappers. But on that Tuesday evening, the 31st of March, I walked into a room that looked like it had been prepared for a funeral or a museum exhibit. Elizabeth was gone. Her bed was made with military precision, hospital corners tucked so tight the fabric groaned. On her desk, 7 pencils were sharpened to identical points and laid out in a perfect diagonal line, pointing toward the closet. My breath hitched. This was not the behavior of a 12-year-old girl. This was the work of someone who had been forced to mimic order under duress. I checked the closet. Her favorite yellow raincoat was gone, but her sneakers were still there. Who walks into a rainstorm in their socks? "Mark!" I screamed, my voice cracking as it hit the hallway. "Mark, she's gone!" My husband appeared in the doorway, a half-eaten apple in his hand, his face a mask of mild annoyance. "Lydia, for heaven's sake, she's probably at Sarah's. You know how she gets when you nag her about the chores." "Look at this room, Mark." I gestured wildly at the sharpened pencils, at the eerie, clinical stillness. "Does this look like Lizzie to you? She did not do this. Someone or something made her do this." Mark sighed, that condescending exhale he used when he thought I was being hysterical. He walked over, picked up a pencil, and set it back down, breaking the perfect diagonal. "She's trying to prove a point. She's showing you she can be neat. Stop projecting your true crime podcasts onto our daughter. She'll be home by 8. But 8 o'clock came and went. Then 9. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the backyard where the woods began, a vast, dark ocean of pine and oak that stretched for 5,000 acres. By 10 o'clock, I was dialing the police. Officer Miller arrived 30 minutes later, smelling of cheap coffee and stale cigarettes. He did not even take his notebook out. "Mrs. Thorne," Miller said, leaning against our kitchen island. "It's a Tuesday night. We have 3 reports of runaways in this district alone tonight. Most of them are at the park or a boyfriend's house. The fact that she cleaned her room? That's not a crime, ma'am. That's a miracle. Call us in 24 hours if she's not back for school." 24 hours? I felt the heat rising in my chest. In 24 hours, she could be across the state line. Look at the note. I shoved the scrap of paper I'd found under the phone. It was written in a beautiful, flowing cursive. "Mother, I have gone to find the place where the light stays. Do not look for me behind the fence." She does not call me Mother, I hissed. She calls me Ma or Lydia when she's being bratty. And we do not have a fence. The officer exchanged a look with Mark, that silent, masculine pact of crazy woman, solidarity. "Maybe she's poetic," Miller shrugged. "Listen, get some sleep. She's probably sleeping in a tent in the backyard to scare you." They left me there. My husband went to bed, murmuring something about giving her space. But the air in the house felt heavy, like the pressure before a cyclone. Every instinct I possessed as a mother, every nerve ending in my body, was screaming that Elizabeth was currently terrified, and that every second I spent standing in that kitchen was a second I was failing her. I did not go to bed. I went to the garage. I grabbed my heavy-duty mag light and a crowbar. I did not know why I needed a crowbar, but the weight of it in my hand felt like the only honest thing left in the world. I walked out the back door. The fence, she mentioned, we did not have one. But 3 miles into the woods, there was an old property line from the 1950s, a rusted chain-link barrier that marked the edge of the old Blackwood estate. The woods were suffocating. The wind hissed through the pines like 1,000 whispering voices. I kept calling her name, but the forest seemed to swallow the sound. I walked for 2 hours, my boots sinking into the mud, my mind racing through every face I'd seen in the neighborhood. Was it the mailman? No, he was 60 years old and walked with a limp. Was it Mr. Henderson from the bakery? No, he was always so kind to her. Then the beam of my flashlight hit something reflective. I stopped. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Hanging from a low branch of a cedar tree was a small, silver locket. I recognized it instantly. I had given it to Elizabeth for her 10th birthday. I reached out to grab it, but as the light shifted, I saw what lay beneath the tree. It was not a body, it was worse. Laid out on the forest floor were Elizabeth's clothes, not scattered, not torn, but laid out flat, as if an invisible girl were wearing them. Her jeans were pulled straight, her socks tucked into the ends of the pant legs, her shirt spread wide. And in the place where her head should have been, there was a large, smooth stone painted with a single, wide-open eye. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, the maglite beam cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" I screamed. Nothing but the wind. But as I turned my light back to the clothes, I noticed something I had missed. Inside the collar of the shirt, there was a small, electronic device, a GPS tracker, but it was not Lizzie's. I picked it up with trembling fingers. On the back, etched into the plastic, were the words, "Property of St. Jude's Parish, Father Thomas." Father Thomas, the man who had sat at our dinner table 3 weeks ago. The man whom my husband called a pillar of the community. The man who had been counseling Elizabeth because she had been acting out. The logic of the world fell away. My husband said I was paranoid. The police said she was a runaway. But the pillar of the community had left a trail of clothes in the middle of a forest like a ritualistic sacrifice. I did not call the police. I knew they would not come. I knew Miller would say I planted it. I knew Mark would say it was a misunderstanding. I looked deeper into the woods, toward the ruins of the Blackwood estate. There was a cellar there, a place where the light did not reach. I gripped the crowbar until my knuckles turned white. "I'm coming, Lizzie," I whispered into the dark. But as I stepped toward the ruins, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. It was the sound of a child laughing. It was not a cry for help. It was a rhythmic, melodic giggle coming from beneath the earth. And then my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number. "You're late for the ceremony, Lydia, but do not worry. We saved the best seat for the guest of honor." The photo attached to the message made me drop the flashlight. It was a picture of my own husband, Mark, holding the same silver locket, smiling into the camera while Elizabeth sat behind him, her eyes vacant and glazed, holding a sharpened pencil to her own throat. The forest seemed to contract around me, the trees leaning in like spectators at a hanging. I stood in the dark, staring at the glowing screen of my phone until the image of Mark's smiling face burned into my retinas. My husband, the man I had shared a bed with for 15 years, the man who had held my hand through 36 hours of labor to bring Elizabeth into this world, was standing in a ruin with a predator, watching our daughter hold a weapon to her own jugular. The betrayal was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in my lungs that made every breath a jagged struggle. The mother's intuition they had all mocked was not just a feeling anymore. It was a map written in fire. I realized then that the order in Elizabeth's room had not been a message from a stranger. It had been a message from Mark. He was the one who insisted on the military-style bed-making when he was angry. He was the one who obsessed over the organization of his workshop. He had not been gaslighting me to protect his ego. He had been gaslighting me to buy time for the ceremony. I picked up my maglite, the heavy metal cold and grounding. I did not head back for the car. I did not head for the main road. I knew that in this small town, the web of pillars of the community ran deeper than a single police officer. If Father Thomas and Mark were together, who else was in that room? The mayor? The sheriff? I moved toward the Blackwood estate. The ruins were a skeletal remains of a Victorian mansion that had burned down in the late 1950s. All that remained were the stone foundations and the sprawling, subterranean cellar network that local teenagers used for dares and drinking. As I approached the stone archway that led to the cellar stairs, I saw a flicker of candlelight. Not the harsh, electric glare of a flashlight, but the soft, rhythmic pulsing of real flames. I descended. The air turned damp and smelled of wet limestone and something sweet, incense. Expensive, church-grade incense. "Elizabeth?" I whispered, my voice barely a vibration. The laughing I had heard earlier started again, but now that I was closer, I realized it was not laughter. It was a recording. A looped digital file of Elizabeth playing on the swings when she was 6 years old. It was being played through a high-end speaker hidden somewhere in the shadows, designed to lure me deeper. I turned a corner and found myself in a wide, circular chamber. The walls were lined with old wine racks, but the bottles had been replaced. Each cubbyhole now held a doll. Hundreds of them. Some were porcelain, some were plastic, but all of them had been altered. Their eyes had been removed and replaced with small, glowing LED bulbs that pulsed in time with the recorded laughter. And in the center of the room, sitting at a long wooden table, was Father Thomas. He was not wearing his priest collar. He was wearing a casual, expensive cashmere sweater, sipping from a crystal glass of amber liquid. He looked like a man enjoying a quiet evening in a library, not a kidnapper in a hole in the ground. "Lydia," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I told Mark you were too sharp for the runaway narrative. A mother's bond is a tether that even the strongest lies cannot snap." "Where is she?" I stepped into the light, raising the crowbar. "Where is my daughter, Thomas? If you've touched her, I will bury this iron in your skull." He chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "Always so violent, Lydia. It's that temperament that drove Mark away, you know. He did not want a wife. He wanted a partner in the great work. And he found one in the parish." "Where is she?" Thomas gestured with his glass toward a heavy steel door at the back of the chamber, the kind of door used for meat lockers or fallout shelters. "She's behind that door, preparing for her transition. But you should be more concerned about what's behind you." I did not turn. I knew that trick. "I'm not looking back, Thomas. Open the door." "I cannot do that," a voice said from the shadows to my left. Mark stepped out. He looked different. His eyes, usually so dull and tired after work, were bright with an almost frantic energy. He was holding a heavy, leather-bound book. "Lydia, honey, listen to me," Mark said, his voice pleading. "You think this is a kidnapping? It's not. It's a rescue. Look at the world out there. It's rotting. The schools, the internet, the filth. Elizabeth was starting to see it. She was starting to drift. Father Thomas showed me the way. We can keep her perfect. We can keep her exactly as she is right now, forever." By making her hold a pencil to her throat, I screamed, my voice echoing off the stone. "You're insane, Mark. You're sick." "The pencil was a test of her obedience," Mark shouted back, his face reddening. "And she passed. She did not flinch. She's ready to become a vessel. She will not have to grow up into a world that will break her. We're going to preserve her." I looked at the dolls on the walls, the eyeless, glowing dolls, and the horror finally clicked. They were not just toys. Each doll was dressed in clothes that looked suspiciously like real children's outfits. A blue dress from the girl who disappeared in 1998, a red hoodie from the boy who moved away 3 years ago. This was not just a cult, it was a collection. How many, Mark? I asked, my voice trembling. How many vessels have you helped him collect? Mark looked down at the book in his hands, a flash of guilt crossing his face before being replaced by a terrifying, blank devotion. 12. Elizabeth will be the 13th, the number of completion. Suddenly, a muffled scream erupted from behind the steel door. It was Elizabeth. It was not a recording this time. It was raw, terrified, and full of pain. The sound shattered my fear. I did not think. I did not plan. I charged. I did not go for Mark. I went for the man holding the glass. Father Thomas did not expect the speed. I swung the maglite with every ounce of maternal rage I possessed. The heavy casing caught him square in the temple. He went down like a sack of stones, the crystal glass shattering against the floor. "Lydia, stop!" Mark lunged for me, grabbing my waist. We hit the floor hard. The crowbar skittered away into the darkness. Mark was stronger than me, his weight pinning me against the cold stone. He was sobbing now, great, racking heaves of breath. "I'm doing this for us. Do not you see? We can be a family forever. No one will ever hurt her if she never leaves this room. You're hurting her right now." I clawed at his face, my nails finding the skin of his cheeks. I managed to bring my knee up, catching him in the solar plexus. He wheezed, his grip loosening for a split second. I rolled away, scrambling toward the steel door. There was no key, just a massive industrial wheel lock. I grabbed the wheel. It would not budge. It was rusted or locked from the inside. "Lizzie! Lizzie, I'm here!" I hammered on the steel. From the other side I heard her voice, faint and sobbing. "Mom, Mom, he has a needle. He says he's going to make me sleep so I do not get old. Help me!" I looked back. Father Thomas was stirring, blood streaming down his face. Mark was getting to his feet, his eyes wild and desperate. He was not the man I loved anymore. He was a broken shell inhabited by a monster's ideology. I looked around the room for a tool, anything. My eyes landed on the heavy, leather-bound book Mark had dropped. "The 13th, I whispered. I grabbed the book and threw it into the pile of incense and candles on the table. The dry parchment caught fire instantly. "No!" Mark screamed, diving toward the flames to save the sacred record. "The names! The lineage!" While he was distracted by his precious book, I grabbed the fallen crowbar and jammed it into the spokes of the wheel lock. I used my entire body weight, screaming a silent prayer to a God I had not spoken to in years. Creak! The wheel turned an inch, then two. Father Thomas was standing now, holding a scalpel he had pulled from his pocket. He did not look like a priest anymore. He looked like a butcher. He started toward me, his steps measured and cold. "You cannot stop the preservation, Lydia," he said, his voice eerily calm despite the blood on his face. "If we cannot have her perfect, we'll have her as a martyr." I gave one final, desperate heave on the crowbar. The lock snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The door swung open, but what I saw inside was not just my daughter. The door did not just open, it exhaled. A gust of frigid, chemically scented air rushed out, carrying the sharp, sterile sting of formaldehyde and ozone. I stepped over the threshold, my crowbar raised, expecting a struggle. But the sight inside froze the marrow in my bones. It was not a dungeon. It was a Victorian parlor, reconstructed with agonizing detail deep beneath the earth. There were velvet armchairs, a mahogany tea table, an ornate floral wallpaper that looked fresh, as if it had been hung yesterday. And there was Elizabeth. She was strapped into a high-backed wooden chair, her arms bound with silk ribbons rather than ropes. Her face was deathly pale, her eyes wide and glassy, staring at a point on the wall. Next to her stood a tall, slender woman I recognized instantly, Mrs. Gable, the town's most respected librarian, the woman who had helped Elizabeth pick out books for her summer reading list for 5 years. Mrs. Gable held a long, silver needle attached to a glass vial. She did not look surprised to see me. She looked disappointed. "Lydia, dear, you're ruining the titration," Mrs. Gable said, her voice as steady as if she were shushing a patron in the reference section. "A few more ounces of the solution, and Elizabeth would have achieved stasis. No more growing pains. No more heartbreak. No more age." "Get away from her," I growled, my voice sounding like it belonged to a wounded animal. I looked past them, into the corners of the room. That's when I saw the others. There were 4 other girls in the parlor. One was sitting on a sofa, a book open in her lap. Another was standing by a faux window, as if looking out at a garden that was not there. It took my brain 3 agonizing seconds to realize they were not breathing. Their skin had a waxy, translucent sheen. Their eyes were glass. They were masterpieces of taxidermy, dressed in clothes from decades past, preserved in a grotesque parody of eternal childhood. You kill them," I whispered, the horror finally crystallizing. "The vessels, you turn them into dolls. We preserve the innocence that the world would otherwise destroy." Father Thomas's voice came from behind me. He was leaning against the doorframe, wiping blood from his eye. "Look at Mary Beth over there on the sofa. She's been 10 years old since 1992. She is perfect. She is untainted by the filth of the modern era." Mark understood this. He wanted his daughter to be a saint, Lydia, not a woman. I looked at Mark, who was standing behind Thomas. He was not looking at me. He was staring at the doll in the red hoodie with a look of pure, religious ecstasy. "She'll never leave us, Lydia," Mark whispered. "She'll never grow to hate us. She'll never move away. We keep her here. We keep the family together." The insanity was so complete, so thick in the air, that I realized words were useless. These people did not live in my world anymore. They lived in a basement where time was a crime and death was a cure. "Mom," Elizabeth's voice was a dry rasp. The drug was already in her system, slowing her heart, dulling her reflexes. "Mom, I cannot move my legs." That was the spark. I did not swing at the men. I swung at the floor lamp next to the mahogany table. The heavy brass base shattered a large glass jar of preservation fluid that sat on the side table. The liquid, highly flammable, based on the smell, splashed across the expensive rug and the lace doilies. "No!" Mrs. Gable shrieked, dropping the needle to save her precious antiques. I lunged for Elizabeth. I did not try to untie the silk ribbons. They were knotted with intricate, ritualistic patterns. Instead, I used the sharp edge of the crowbar's hook to saw through them. "Mark, stop her," Thomas commanded. My husband moved toward me, but he was hesitant. He saw the fire in my eyes, a literal fire, as a spark from the shattered lamp ignited the spilled chemicals. A blue flame began to lick at the hem of the doll in the red hoodie. "The vessels!" Mark screamed. Diverted, he dived for the flaming doll, trying to smother the fire with his jacket. To him, the preserved corpse was more valuable than his living daughter. I sliced the last ribbon on Elizabeth's left arm. "Lizzie, stand up! You have to help me!" She tumbled out of the chair, her legs buckling. I caught her, throwing her arm over my shoulder. She was a dead weight, her nervous system shutting down under the influence of whatever Mrs. Gable had injected. Father Thomas blocked the exit. He had a heavy iron fireplace poker in his hand now. "You are not leaving, Lydia. If you will not let her be a saint, then you'll both be ashes." He swung. The poker whistled past my ear, striking the wooden chair where Lizzie had been sitting just seconds before. The wood splintered. I was backed into a corner, holding my semi-conscious daughter, facing a priest with a poker and a librarian with a scalpel. The room was filling with thick, black smoke as the various preservatives caught fire. The dolls were melting, their plastic eyes dripping like tears, their vintage clothes curling into ash. "Mark!" I yelled through the smoke. "Mark, look at her. She's dying. Not like your dolls, she's actually dying." Mark looked up from the burning corpse of the girl from 1998. He looked at Elizabeth, who was gasping for air, her face turning a sickly blue from the smoke. For a fleeting second, the fog of the cult seemed to lift from his eyes. He saw the reality, the fire, the blood, and his daughter's life slipping away. "Thomas, stop," Mark said, his voice trembling. "We have to get her out. The air, it's too much." "The air is the world, Mark," Thomas shouted, his face contorted in a demonic mask. "The fire is the only thing that can purify this now. Move!" Thomas lunged at me again, but this time someone stepped in the way. It was Mark. He took the blow of the iron poker across his shoulder. He groaned, falling to his knees, but he grabbed Thomas's legs, tackling him into the center of the growing inferno. "Run, Lydia," Mark barked, his voice filled with a sudden, tragic clarity. "Take her and go. I'll keep them here." "Mark, no! Go!" I did not have time to mourn. I did not have time to forgive. I dragged Elizabeth toward the door. Behind me, I heard the sound of a struggle, the grunts of men fighting in a furnace, the shattering of glass, and the high-pitched, rhythmic laughter of the looped recording that was still playing somewhere in the walls. I burst out of the parlor into the wine cellar. The dolls on the walls were pulsing with light, their LED eyes flickering as the power lines began to melt. It felt like running through a gauntlet of ghosts. I reached the stairs. My lungs were screaming. Elizabeth was fading, her head lolling against my chest. "Stay with me, Lizzie. Just a few more steps. Stay with me." I climbed. 1 step, 2. The weight of her was immense, but the adrenaline of a hunted animal provided a strength I did not know I possessed. I reached the surface. The cool night air hit us like a benediction. I did not stop. I ran until the ruins of the Blackwood estate were 100 yards behind us, until the orange glow of the fire began to vent through the cracks in the earth. I collapsed onto the damp moss, pulling Elizabeth onto my lap. I checked her pulse. It was thready, weak, but it was there. "It's okay," I sobbed, stroking her hair. "It's okay. We're out. We're safe." But as I looked back at the ruins, I saw a figure emerge from the smoke. It was not Mark. It was Officer Miller. He was standing by his patrol car, which was parked silently in the trees with no lights on. He was holding a radio to his mouth. "Target is outside," Miller said, his voice cold and professional. "Mother is alive. Daughter is compromised. Send the cleaning crew to the north perimeter. We cannot let this reach the morning news." He lowered the radio and looked directly at me. He did not draw his gun. He drew a long, silver needle, the exact same kind Mrs. Gable had used. "You really should have listened to your husband, Lydia," Miller said, walking toward us across the clearing. "He was just trying to save you the paperwork." I looked down at the crowbar still gripped in my hand. I looked at my daughter. I realized then that the basement was not the end of the cult. The basement was just the showroom. The entire town was the warehouse. The betrayal hit me with a force more chilling than the midnight air. Officer Miller was not just a negligent cop. He was the perimeter guard for the nightmare. As he stepped across the clearing, the moonlight glinted off the needle in his hand, a silver sliver of peace that would turn my daughter into a statue and me into a memory. "Do not come any closer, Miller," I rasped, struggling to pull Elizabeth's dead weight further into the shadows of the pine trees. "Lydia, look at yourself," Miller said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He kept coming, his heavy boots crunching rhythmically on the dry needles. "You're exhausted. You're covered in soot and blood. Who is the world going to believe? A grieving mother who lost her mind and burned down a historic site with her husband inside? Or the officer who tried to save her from her own breakdown?" He was right. That was the most terrifying part of their logic. They had built a world where my truth sounded like a fever dream. "Where's Mark?" I demanded, trying to buy seconds as my eyes darted for an escape route. Mark was a true believer, but he was weak, Miller shrugged. He let his emotions get in the way of the preservation. "He's staying in the cellar, Lydia. Permanent stasis. Now, give me the girl. We can still fix this for her. We have another parlor ready." The thought of Elizabeth being fixed by these monsters sent a jolt of pure electricity through my exhausted limbs. I looked at the crowbar. It was a crude weapon against a trained officer with a gun on his hip and a needle in his hand, but it was all I had. "Catch us if you can, you bastard," I whispered. I did not run away from him. I ran sideways, deeper into the densest part of the blackwood thorns. I dragged Elizabeth behind a massive, rotting oak stump just as Miller lunged. He tripped on a protruding root, the needle flying from his hand and vanishing into the leaf litter. "Damn it!" he roared, his facade of calm finally cracking. I did not wait. I knew these woods better than he did. I had spent my childhood summers exploring these trails before the estate was fenced off. I knew about the Devil's Throat, a narrow limestone crevice about half a mile to the east that led down into an old drainage pipe. If I could get her there, he could not follow with his broad shoulders. I heaved Elizabeth onto my back in a fireman's carry. My spine felt like it was being compressed by a hydraulic press, and my lungs burned with the remnants of the cellar smoke. But the adrenaline overrode the pain. I moved in a low crouch, using the thickets as cover. Behind me, I could hear Miller calling into his radio. "She's heading east toward the ravine. Get the dogs from the kennel. And tell the mayor we need the white van on County Road 12. The white van, the transport for the vessels. The woods became a blur of scratching branches and uneven ground. Every time I heard a twig snap, my heart nearly stopped. I reached the edge of the Devil's Throat. It was a jagged split in the earth, barely 2 feet wide, choked with moss and ivy. "Lizzie, honey, wake up," I whispered, slapping her cheeks gently. Her eyes fluttered, the pupils still pinpricks from the drug. "I need you to slide. Slide down into the hole. I'll be right behind you." She moaned, a sound of pure confusion, but she slumped into the crevice. I pushed her gently, watching as she disappeared into the darkness of the earth. I scrambled in after her, the jagged rocks tearing at my jacket and skin. We dropped 6 feet into a concrete pipe, half filled with stagnant, freezing water. The smell was horrendous, rot and old rain, but it was a sanctuary. "Shh." I pressed my hand over Elizabeth's mouth. Above us, the heavy thud of boots stopped. "I know you're down there, Lydia." Miller's voice echoed into the pipe, sounding distorted and metallic. "You're just making it harder on her. The longer she stays in that filth, the more tainted she becomes. Is that what you want? To ruin her perfection?" I sat in the dark water, holding my daughter's shivering body, and felt a surge of loathing so intense it felt like a physical weight. Perfection, that was their word for death. Their word for a girl who could not speak, could not grow, could not defy them. Miller stood over the crevice for what felt like an eternity. Then his radio chirped. "Officer Miller, we have a problem. The fire at the estate, it's not staying underground. The gas lines from the old mansion have ignited. The fire department is on the way. We cannot stop them." "Interstate them," Miller hissed into the radio. "Block the road." "It's too late. The chief of fire is not in the circle. He's already on site. We need to clear out. Now. Miller let out a guttural scream of rage. He kicked a spray of gravel into the crevice. This is not over, Lydia. You cannot stay in a hole forever. And when you come out, the whole world will be looking for the woman who murdered her husband. The boots receded. A car engine roared to life in the distance and faded away. Silence returned to the woods, broken only by the drip of water in the pipe and Elizabeth's shallow, ragged breathing. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice finally sounding like herself, though weak. "Is he gone?" "He's gone, baby, for now." I crawled toward the end of the pipe, where it opened out into a small creek bed. The sky was beginning to turn a bruised purple, the first hint of dawn. I looked at my daughter. She was covered in mud, her dress was torn, and she was shivering uncontrollably. She looked ruined by their standards. To me, she had never looked more beautiful. But as we crawled out into the morning light, I saw something that made my heart drop. On the opposite bank of the creek, sitting on a flat stone, was Elizabeth's school backpack. I had not brought it. Miller had not brought it. I walked toward it, my hand trembling. I opened the front pocket. Inside was a small digital tape recorder and a single, fresh rose. I pressed play. A woman's voice, not Mrs. Gable's, but a voice I recognized from the local news. The voice of the district attorney filled the morning air. "Lydia, you performed admirably. The fire was a necessary cleansing. But you see, the circle does not just need vessels. We need mothers. Women with your tenacity. Your husband was a fool to think we wanted to keep Elizabeth in a basement. We want to keep her in the Capitol. And you are going to help us get her there." The recording ended with a sharp, electronic beep. I looked up at the horizon. The smoke from the Blackwood estate was a black pillar against the rising sun. I realized then that I had not escaped the labyrinth. I had just moved into a bigger room. The police were not coming to arrest me. They were coming to rescue me. They would give me a medal. They would call me a hero. They would tell the world I saved my daughter from a lone wolf priest. And then they would wait. They would wait until the cameras were gone, until the world was looking elsewhere. And then they would come for us again, not with needles in basements, but with scholarships and careers and opportunities. I looked at the crowbar in my hand. Then I looked at the rose. I realized what I had to do. If I could not trust the law, and I could not trust the truth, I would have to become the very thing they feared most. "Lizzie," I said, my voice cold and hard as the iron in my hand, "we are not going home." "Where are we going, Ma?" "To find the people who are not in the circle," I said. "And then, we're going to burn the rest of the world down."